The town of Calder Flats, Texas, had many legends in the year 1874, but none quite so strange and persistent as the one about the man who lived on the hill at the edge of the property known as Ridgeback Farm. The man nobody ever saw. The man they had taken to calling Ghost. Hester Townsend had been a widow for 14 months when she first noticed him, and the noticing itself was such a quiet, unremarkable thing that she almost missed the importance of it entirely. She had been standing at her kitchen window in the gray pre-dawn light, waiting on her coffee to boil, watching the mist curl low across the back pasture like something alive and restless, when she saw a shape moving along the ridgeline above her property. A man, tall and lean, walking with the unhurried, purposeful stride of someone who had somewhere specific to be. He was maybe 300 yards off, little more than a silhouette against the violet sky, but she could see the broad set of his shoulders and the way his hat brim dipped forward, shading his face from what little light the early morning offered. Without thinking about it, she raised her hand and waved. He stopped walking. She could feel, even at that distance, the weight of his attention. Then, after a long moment in which neither of them moved and the mist continued its slow drift across the grass, he raised his own hand once briefly and walked on into the tree line and was gone. Hester stood there for a moment longer, her coffee forgotten, her hand still hovering at the level of her shoulder. Then she let it drop and turned back to her stove and thought, well, someone is living up on that ridge. She did not think much more about it that first morning. She had a great many things demanding her attention. The farm had belonged to her late husband, Gerald Townsend, who had come west from Virginia with big dreams and a smaller aptitude for the practical realities of frontier life than he had imagined. He had been a good man, kind and soft-spoken, but the farm had never truly thrived under his management, and when he died of a fever in the autumn of 1872, he had left Hester with 20 acres of moderately good land, a house that needed a new roof on the eastern side, 16 head of cattle, a mule named Solomon who had opinions about everything, and debts that were manageable but only just. He had left her no children, which was both a grief and, she sometimes admitted to herself in her most honest moments, a particular kind of mercy, because at least she was answerable to no one but herself. She was 26 years old, which in Calder Flats made her either a subject of pity or a subject of interest, depending on who you asked. The men at the general store sometimes looked at her with a speculative quality that she had learned to meet with a flat, unwelcoming gaze. The women of the church sewing circle were kind enough but had a tendency to treat her like a problem that needed solving, which usually meant they were considering which of their brothers or cousins or neighbors might be a suitable second husband. Hester had thus far managed to deflect every such suggestion with a polite firmness that she suspected was starting to be read as stubbornness. She was not, she told herself, against the idea of another husband eventually. She was simply not prepared to choose one out of necessity rather than genuine feeling. She had married Gerald at 22 because he was gentle and decent, and because she had cared for him, and she did not regret it. But she was not going to let loneliness or financial pressure push her into something lesser. She had the farm. She had Solomon the opinionated mule. She had her kitchen garden and her 16 cattle and her own 2 capable hands. She would be fine. She saw the man on the ridge again the next morning and the morning after that. Each time she was at her kitchen window in that same gray early hour, and each time he was walking the same line along the top of the ridge, heading in the same direction, west toward the stand of cottonwoods that marked the edge of what the old-timers called the Hale property. Each time she waved, and each time he stopped and raised his hand in return. It became a ritual before she had consciously decided to make it one. She asked about the Hale property at the general store one Thursday afternoon when she had come in to collect flour and salt and a new length of cotton ticking for a pillow that had finally given up. Rufus Colby, who ran the store and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the history and gossip of Calder Flats dating back to its founding in 1859, leaned on his counter and considered her question with the careful attention of a man who enjoyed being the source of information. "Hale property," he said. "That's the old parcel up on the North Ridge, backs up against the creek. Nobody's worked that land in, 12 years or more. Old Marcus Hale died in '62, left it to his boy. The boy went off to the war." "Which side?" Hester asked, because it still mattered in certain conversations in 1874. Rufus shrugged with the practiced neutrality of a man whose business survived by not taking sides. "Union, I believe. Boy came back, but by then everything was different. Town was different. He kept to himself mostly. People see his smoke sometimes up on the ridge. A few people swear they've seen him in town once or twice, years back, but nobody's had a real conversation with him in a long time. It's like he's a ghost." Rufus paused and seemed to find this description satisfying. "That's what people took to calling him, actually. The ghost on the ridge, or just ghost. Nobody uses his given name anymore because nobody talks to him enough to use it." "What is his given name?" Hester asked. Rufus had to think about it. "Owen," he said finally. "Owen Hale. Must be 30 years old by now, give or take." Owen Hale, Hester thought, walking home with her flour and her salt and her cotton ticking. Not a ghost at all, then. Just a man who had come home from a terrible war to find the world had rearranged itself in his absence, and who had apparently decided that the ridge and the creek and the trees were preferable company to the town of Calder Flats. She understood the impulse, frankly. She waved at him the next morning with something new in it, now that she had a name to put to the silhouette. He was there as always, same hour, same ridge, same unhurried walk. When he stopped and raised his hand in response, she found herself studying his posture with more attention than she had before. He stood very still when he stopped, not the restless stillness of someone holding himself back, but the deep, settled stillness of a man who was entirely comfortable in his own company and the company of the wild land around him. She wondered if he had enough to eat. It was this practical concern, she told herself, and nothing else, that prompted her to bake an extra loaf of bread the following week and leave it on the fence post at the northern corner of her property, the corner closest to the ridge and the Hale land. She left it there in the morning after her wave, wrapped in cloth, with no note because she did not know what she would have written. The next morning the bread was gone. In its place was a small bundle of wild herbs, carefully tied with a strip of leather, the kind of bundle that someone knowledgeable about plants and medicine would have put together. Hester recognized sage and yarrow, and something that she thought might be wild ginger. She stood holding it in her hands in the cool morning air and felt, of all the unexpected things, a sharp and sudden warmth in the center of her chest. She put the herbs in a jar of water on her kitchen windowsill, and they were still there when she waved at him the next morning. The summer of 1874 rolled on with the relentless heat of the Texas high plains, baking the earth to a pale, dust-colored hardness and testing the patience of every person and animal in Calder Flats. Hester's cattle were restless in the heat, and she spent long, sweaty days moving them between the 3 water sources on her property, checking their hooves, watching for the signs of heat sickness in the youngest of them. She was not afraid of hard work. Gerald had taught her what he knew about cattle in the 4 years they had been married, and what he had not known, she had learned by watching and asking questions and making mistakes. One morning in late July, she came out of the barn after the early feeding to find that her eastern fence line, the one that ran along the base of the ridge, had been repaired. 3 posts that had been leaning badly for 2 weeks, which she had put on her list of things to get to but had not yet managed, were now standing straight and firm, the wire stretched taut and clean between them. The work was neat and professional, the kind of work that suggested long practice and genuine care. There was no one in sight. The ridge was empty, the morning quiet except for the distant sound of a meadowlark. Hester stood looking at the repaired fence for a long moment. Then she looked up at the ridge, though there was no silhouette there at this hour, and she said to no one in particular, "Thank you, Owen Hale." She left another loaf of bread on the fence post. The following week she left bread and a jar of her blackberry preserves. She had made them herself from the wild blackberries that grew along the creek that ran through the southern edge of her property, and she considered them among her better achievements. The morning after, the bread and preserves were gone, and in their place was a small wooden figure. It was a horse, carved from a pale piece of wood, smooth and detailed and surprisingly beautiful. The legs were delicate, the neck arched just so, the tiny carved mane falling to one side in a gesture that was somehow both accurate and gentle. Hester turned it over in her hands and felt that warmth in her chest again, stronger now. This man, whoever he was, had not gone feral or wild in his years alone on the ridge. There was careful thought in everything he left behind. There was intention. She set the carved horse on her kitchen windowsill beside the jar of wildflowers, and every morning after that when she stood at the window and waved, she could see it there in her peripheral vision, small and perfect and present. It was the first week of August when she finally heard his voice. She had been out in the pasture in the late afternoon, wrestling with a section of wire that had gotten tangled in on itself, and was beyond her ability to sort out with just her hands, when she became aware that she was no longer alone. She did not hear him approach, which she would later find was characteristic of Owen Hale, who moved with a quietness that was not stealthy so much as simply natural, the way a man moves when he has spent years in the company of wild things that are frightened by noise. She straightened up and turned, and he was standing about 20 feet away, still as a post, watching her with eyes that were a very clear, very light gray, the color of a sky just before rain comes. He was taller than she had realized from her window observations, and leaner, with the particular kind of lean that spoke of a life spent in physical labor rather than deprivation. His face was weathered to a deep brown, with lines at the corners of his eyes that she found herself immediately fond of. He was wearing a plain shirt of faded blue cotton and worn dark trousers and boots that had seen considerable hard use, and his hat was pulled low in a way that suggested habit rather than concealment. He was holding her fence wire in both hands, already working it free of itself with quiet, methodical patience. "Oh," Hester said, because it was the first thing that came to her. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with a slight rasp to it, as though it had not been used enough lately to be fully comfortable. "That twist needs to come out before you can stretch it proper." "I can see that," Hester said. "I just couldn't get a good angle on it." He nodded once, focused on the wire, and within a minute had the tangle out and the section ready to stretch. He looked up at her then, a brief, questioning look, and she realized he was waiting for her to take her end. They fixed the fence together in a comfortable silence that Hester found remarkable, because silence with most people required effort, a conscious holding of breath and words, but silence with this man felt simply like the natural state of things, like how quiet it got when the wind dropped. When it was done, he stepped back and looked at the line of it with the critical eye of a craftsman checking his work. "It'll hold," he said. "Thank you," she said. She paused, and then, because she was not a woman who played games with language, she said, "I'm Hester Townsend. I expect you know that, but I thought we should properly introduce ourselves, since we've been exchanging things over the fence for a month now." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the same neighborhood, and it transformed his face in a way that she found unexpectedly affecting. "Owen Hale," he said. "I know," she said. "Rufus Colby told me." Owen Hale's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something guarded moving through those clear gray eyes. "What else did he tell you?" "That you were away during the war, that you came back, that nobody in town sees much of you." She looked at him directly because she believed in directness. "He called you Ghost." The word landed between them and sat there. Owen looked out toward the tree line, and she watched the set of his jaw tighten and then relax, the way a man processes something he has long since made his peace with but still finds unpleasant. "I heard that's what they call me," he said. "It's not a kind name," Hester said. "No," he agreed. But I haven't given them many opportunities to use a kinder one. There was something honest in this, a frank acknowledgement of his own role in the situation that she respected enormously. She looked at him for a moment longer and then said, "I have coffee on if you want some." He looked at her then directly, and she had the feeling that no one had offered him coffee in a very long time. The gray eyes held something that she might have called surprised, or perhaps hopeful if she was reading it correctly, which she was not entirely certain she was. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "I'd like that." The kitchen of Hester's farmhouse was small and warm and smelled of the herbs drying in bundles from the ceiling beams, and the coffee brewing on the iron stove. Owen Hale sat at her kitchen table with the care of a man who was aware of taking up space that was not his own, and she set a cup in front of him and poured her own and sat across from him, and they drank their coffee in the afternoon light that came through the window and fell across the table in a long, warm rectangle. The carved horse on the windowsill caught the light and threw a small shadow. "I saw you'd put it there," he said, looking at it. "It's beautiful work," she said. He looked down at his coffee cup. "Had a lot of time to practice." There was a great deal contained in that sentence and they both knew it, but she did not press on it and he did not expand on it, and somehow that mutual restraint felt like an agreement, a first small act of consideration for each other. He stayed for one cup of coffee and then rose and said he ought to get back, and she walked him to the door and watched him cross her yard with that long, unhurried stride, heading back up toward the ridge, and something in her chest did a thing she had not expected it to do, a sort of reaching, as though something inside her recognized something in him and was leaning toward it without being asked. She stood in her doorway for a long time after he disappeared into the tree line. He came back 3 days later, not in the evening this time, but in the morning, shortly after she had finished her wave from the kitchen window. She heard the sound of an axe against wood and went out to find Owen Hale splitting logs at the woodpile behind her barn. He had brought his own axe. He had been there for some time, judging by the neat stack of split wood that had already accumulated. She watched him for a moment from the back porch before he noticed her, and she found herself thinking that there was something almost peaceful about watching him work, the rhythm of it, the controlled economy of his movements, the way he seemed entirely absorbed in the task without straining. He lowered the axe and straightened when he saw her. "Your woodpile was low," he said by way of explanation. "I was going to get to it," she said. "I know," he said. "I got to it first." She brought him water and then went about her own morning work, and they moved around each other's presence with a naturalness that struck her, later, as unusual for two people who had spoken to each other only once before. But there was nothing awkward about Owen Hale's presence on her farm. He worked hard and without fuss, and he did not hover or require entertainment, and when they sat on the back porch in the noon hour and ate the bread and cold beef she brought out, they talked a little and were quiet a little, and both felt equally good. She learned things about him in pieces over the weeks that followed. He had grown up on the Hale property, the only child of Marcus Hale and his wife Ellen, who had died when Owen was 12. He had enlisted in the Union Army in 1862 at 18 years old, driven partly by conviction and partly, she suspected, by a young man's desire to be somewhere other than alone on a ridge with a grief-stricken father. He had served for 3 years, seen things he did not speak of in any detail, but which had clearly left their marks in the lines around his eyes and the particular quality of his stillness, which was not peaceful stillness, but rather the stillness of a man who had learned to keep himself very controlled. He had come home in 1865 to find his father 2 months dead, the house in poor repair, and the town changed around him in ways that made him feel like a visitor rather than a resident. He had fixed the house and worked the land and slowly, without quite intending to, had retreated into a life that required very little contact with the world beyond his ridge. He did not say all of this directly. He said pieces of it at different times in different ways, and Hester assembled the picture with care and patience, because she understood that some things needed to be offered in fragments rather than all at once, and she was not in a hurry. She told him things in return. She told him about growing up in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a practical, warm-hearted mother who had died when Hester was 17. She told him about marrying Gerald and coming west and the 4 years of their marriage, which had been good years, genuinely good, even if the farm had been a constant struggle. She told him about the 14 months since Gerald's death, which had been the hardest of her life, not because of grief exactly, though there was grief, but because of the sheer weight of being entirely responsible for everything, with no one to share the burden or the deciding. Owen listened with complete attention. This was something she noticed about him early and valued increasingly. He listened the way most people did not, without planning his next sentence while she was speaking, without the look of someone waiting for a gap to fill. He simply listened, and his gray eyes were steady, and she felt heard in a way that she had not felt in a long time. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early September when she came back from checking on her northern cattle to find 3 men on horseback at the edge of her yard. Men she did not know, with the particular look of men who were passing through and had decided to stop without being invited. Their horses were dusty and hard-ridden, and the men themselves had the worn, edgy quality of people who had been a long time without comfort or regular meals. Hester came around the corner of the barn and stopped when she saw them, and the tallest of the 3, a man with a sunburned face and a long, greasy mustache, leaned forward on his saddle and looked at her with an interest that made her want to step back into the barn. "Ma'am," he said, with a courtesy that was entirely surface. "We're looking for water and maybe a meal if you're offering." "I can give you water," Hester said, keeping her voice even. "From the trough by the fence there. I'm not set up for feeding." "Now that's a shame," the man said, not moving. His 2 companions were watching her with the same unsettling attention. "Big farm like this. Woman alone out here, you might want to be a little more neighborly." "I'm neighborly when the neighbor's manner warrants it," Hester said. Her heart was beating faster, but she kept her face calm, because she had learned that showing fear to this kind of man was rarely useful. The tall man was about to say something further when the quality of the afternoon air changed in a subtle way that Hester had begun to recognize, and Owen Hale materialized from the shadow of the barn doorway as though he had simply stepped out of the wall, which was essentially what he had done. He was carrying nothing visible, but he stood between Hester and the 3 horsemen with a quiet, settled presence that filled the space entirely. "She said water from the trough," Owen said. His voice was perfectly level, without heat or aggression. "There's nothing else being offered here." The 3 men looked at Owen with the evaluating look that men in this country used when sizing up a potential problem, and whatever they saw in his gray eyes or his steady stillness made a calculation run silently across the tall one's face. He gathered his reins. "No offense intended," he said, and it was almost convincing. "None taken," Owen said, in a tone that suggested he did not particularly care either way. The 3 men watered their horses and rode on without further conversation, and Hester let out a breath that she had been holding for what felt like several minutes. "How long were you in the barn?" she asked. "Came by to look at that hinge on the south door," he said. "Heard them ride in." She looked at him, this quiet man who had stepped out of a shadow to stand between her and trouble without fanfare or performance, and she felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been balanced carefully for a long time beginning to lean in one clear direction. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her with those clear gray eyes and said, "You should have a dog." She laughed, and the laugh surprised her because it was entirely genuine and free. And Owen Hale's face did the thing again at its corners, the thing that was not quite a smile but was unmistakably warm, and she thought that she wanted very much to see him smile, a real one, all the way, and that she would wait as long as it took. She got the dog, actually. A big, shaggy, amber-colored creature of uncertain parentage that she bought from a farmer outside of town for $2, and she named him Walter. And Walter had strong feelings about everybody he met, mostly negative, except for Owen Hale, with whom he was immediately and unreservedly devoted. Walter began following Owen around whenever Owen was on the property, which made Hester laugh often and Owen look quietly pleased, though he would not have said so. The leaves began to turn in October, painting the ridge above her farm in colors that shifted from gold to amber to a deep, burning red, and Hester began to think about the winter coming and what it would mean for the rhythm they had settled into, she and Owen. These mornings and afternoons of shared work, and shared coffee and conversation that came in its own time without being forced. She thought about it on a cool, bright October morning while she was standing at her kitchen window with her coffee, watching the ridge, waiting for his silhouette to appear. When it did, right on time, she raised her hand and waved, and he stopped and raised his hand in return, same as always, except that this morning he did not immediately walk on. He stood there for a long moment, and even at 300 yards she could feel the quality of his attention, full and still and directed entirely at her. Then he did something he had never done before. He changed direction, turning away from the cottonwoods and coming down from the ridge toward her farm. She had time to fill a second cup of coffee before he knocked at the kitchen door. He sat at her table and she sat across from him, and the morning light came in long and golden, and he turned his coffee cup in his hands once, twice, and then looked up at her and said, "I want to tell you some things." "All right," she said, and he told her. He told her about the war in more detail than he had ever offered before, not the battles or the specific violence of it, but the internal experience of it, what it was like to go in as a young man full of conviction, and come out the other side changed in ways that were not visible from the outside, but were profound and permanent on the inside. He told her about the specific horror of coming home and finding his father dead, and the house silent, and the town looking at him like he was already half a memory. He told her about the years that had followed, the slow building of a life on the ridge that was quiet and manageable and required very little of him emotionally, which had felt like relief for a long time and had only more recently started to feel like something else. "Like what?" she asked quietly. He looked at her for a moment. "Like a different kind of being lost," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Walter was asleep by the stove, his big amber body radiating heat. The carved horse on the windowsill caught the morning light. "I know something about that," she said. "I know you do," he said. "That's partly why I'm telling you." She understood what he was saying. She understood it in the clear, uncomplicated way that you understand something when it names a thing you have felt but not yet found words for. And she felt, sitting across the kitchen table from Owen Hale in the October light, that she was being seen by someone who was also seeing himself in her, and that this mutual recognition was one of the most significant things that had ever happened to her. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Just her hand, flat on the table, resting over the back of his. He looked down at it and then up at her, and those gray eyes held something that was not guarded anymore, not careful, not managed, just present and open and entirely directed at her. He turned his hand over so that their palms were touching, and his fingers closed around hers, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and it was one of the best silences Hester had ever sat inside. He came every day after that, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon. He fixed the east side of her roof, which had needed attention since before Gerald died, and she held the ladder and handed up shingles, and they talked while he worked, the conversation ranging freely from the practical details of farm management to the books they had both read in different circumstances, and the people who had shaped them, and the things they thought about the country they were living in, which was a country still working out what it meant and who it was for, often at great cost to those who had the least power in the negotiating. Owen had opinions about this that surprised her in their depth and clarity, given how much he had withdrawn from the world. He had not stopped thinking, she realized, just because he had stopped participating. He had been watching and considering all this time from his ridge, reading the newspapers he picked up on his occasional solitary trips to Calder Flats, forming views that had nowhere to go until now. She told him about the families she had seen in her drive west from Ohio, the people who had been displaced and dispossessed, and the injustice of it, the way the machinery of westward expansion consumed people as fuel without any accounting for the cost to them. Owen listened and added and pushed back in the right places, and she found these conversations among the most stimulating she had ever had, a constant surprise and pleasure. One afternoon in late October he was up on her roof and she was in the kitchen baking, and she heard him start to whistle up there, a low, meandering tune, nothing she recognized, just melody for its own sake, and she stopped what she was doing and stood still and listened to it and felt such a fierce, uncomplicated happiness that her eyes stung. She had not heard him whistle before. She was fairly certain he had not whistled in a long time. The first hard frost came in early November, and with it a clarity and coldness that made the mornings crisp and blue and beautiful. Hester began wearing her heavy shawl for the window ritual, standing in its warmth with her coffee while she watched for Owen's silhouette on the ridge, and he was always there, always punctual, and the wave had become something she anticipated with a pleasure entirely disproportionate to the brevity of the gesture. She had begun to understand that she was in love with him. This was not a conclusion she had arrived at suddenly or dramatically. It had come the way the dawn came, incrementally, the light growing so slowly that you could not point to the exact moment it shifted from dark to light, only to the undeniable fact that it was fully morning now and had been for some time. She was in love with his quietness and his steadiness, and the way he listened, and the way his hands looked when he was working, and the way his voice sounded when he said her name, and the particular rare quality of his full attention. She was in love with the carved horse on her windowsill, and the bundles of herbs, and the fence posts he had fixed without being asked. She was in love with the man who had stood between her and those three horsemen with a stillness more powerful than any bravado could have been. She had not told him any of this. She was fairly certain, in the direct and honest way that was her nature, that he felt the same way. The hand-holding had become a regular feature of their coffee times. He had begun sitting closer to her on the porch bench than strictly necessary. There were moments, increasingly frequent, when he would be in the middle of a sentence, and she would find him looking at her with his full mouth set in a way that suggested he was thinking about something he had not said yet. But he was a careful man. She understood why. A man who had spent years building walls between himself and the world needed to trust the person he was about to let through them, and trust was built slowly and could not be rushed without damage. She was not rushing him. What she was not quite prepared for was the afternoon in mid-November when she came in from checking the cattle to find a letter on her kitchen table that had been slid under the door. A thick envelope with a return address from Virginia that she did not immediately recognize, and opened it to find a letter from Gerald's elder brother, a man named Franklin Townsend, who she had met exactly twice and had never corresponded with, informing her with a brisk and not particularly warm efficiency that Gerald had owed him money, $240 borrowed before they had come west, and that he intended to call in the debt, and that if payment could not be arranged, he would be seeking legal remedy, which in the territory of Texas in 1874 could mean a great many unpleasant things. Hester sat down at her kitchen table with the letter in her hands and felt the cold, particular weight of financial dread settle into her stomach. She had not known about the debt. Gerald had not told her, which was the kind of thing that, in the 14 months since his death, she had learned was more common than she might have hoped. The small private worries he had carried alone rather than trouble her with, which was a form of care that became, in retrospect, a form of difficulty. $240 was a very great deal of money. It was not an impossible sum, but it was close, given where her account stood coming into winter. She sat with the letter until Owen knocked at her door in the late afternoon, and when she let him in, she did not try to compose her face into something more cheerful, because she was tired and worried, and because she had learned that she did not need to perform anything for Owen Hale. He saw it immediately, the way he always saw things, that careful, attentive reading of whatever was actually there. "What happened?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it in that thorough way of his, and she watched his face while he read and saw the tension come into his jaw. He set the letter on the table and looked at her. "What do you have on hand?" "Close to $90, she said, "and I could sell 3 or 4 of the cattle at fair price, which would bring it up close." "Selling cattle going into winter leaves you short in spring," he said. "I know that," she said, "but it's the option I have." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "I have some money set aside. I don't need it for anything in particular. I could lend you what you're short." She looked at him. "I'm not taking your savings, Owen." "It's not charity," he said, and there was something steady and serious in how he said it. "It's a loan. I'm not offering it as a gift. I'm offering it because you'd pay it back, and because selling cattle in November is a bad idea, and because I don't want you starting the spring already behind." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, because she felt dangerously close to something emotional that she was not quite ready to be emotional about. She thought about her practical situation honestly, the way she always thought about things honestly, and she thought about spring and the cattle and what she needed to be solvent and not scrambling. "I would pay you back," she said. "I know you would," he said, without a moment's hesitation, and the simple, absolute certainty of it, that he did not have to think about whether he trusted her, went through her like a shaft of warm light. They worked out the terms at the kitchen table, businesslike and clear, because Hester believed in clarity and Owen appreciated it. And when the terms were agreed, he wrote down the amount in a small notebook he had in his shirt pocket, and she wrote it down in her household accounts book, and they shook hands on it across the table like two serious people completing a serious transaction. Then they sat there with their hands still clasped over the table and looked at each other, and Owen said quietly, "I don't like the idea of him coming here." "He may not come in person," she said, "but he might." "Yes. Then when he does, I'd like to be here," Owen said. She thought about 3 horsemen in her yard and Owen stepping out of the shadow of the barn, and she thought about the quality of this man's presence, quiet and without threat but entirely unmovable, and she thought that, yes, she would not mind Owen Hale being present when Franklin Townsend arrived. "All right," she said. He arrived 10 days later, Franklin Townsend, in a rented buggy from Calder Flats, a heavy-set man of 50, with the flushed, prosperous look of someone who had done reasonably well in the years after the war, and was not inclined to forgive the world for the portion he had not managed to accumulate. He had sent no advance notice, just arrived on a Wednesday morning while Hester was at the fence checking the cattle. Owen was repairing her south gate, which had developed a sag, and he was there when Hester came across the yard to meet her brother-in-law. Franklin Townsend looked at Owen with a quick, assessing look, and then at Hester with an expression that suggested he was drawing conclusions she had not invited him to draw. "Mrs. Townsend," he said, with the kind of familiarity that asserted a claim. "Mr. Townsend," she said, with the kind of formality that made clear there was no such claim. "I've written to you that I have the funds in full. I intended to send them to you by post." He blinked, clearly having expected a different opening. "Well," he said, "all the same I thought it best to come in person given the amount involved." "The amount is accounted for," she said. "I'll get it for you." She went inside and came back with the money, counted out in full, and she watched Franklin Townsend go through the experience of a man who had arrived expecting leverage, discovering he did not have any. He counted the money twice, which she found both insulting and entirely predictable, and then produced a receipt which she signed and he signed, and that was that. He lingered a little longer than necessary, looking around the farm with the appraising look of a man who was calculating its value against his own interest, and then he looked at Owen again with that same unsubtle curiosity. "Hired hand," he said to Hester. "A friend," she said. Owen, at the gate, did not look up from what he was doing. He simply went on working with that complete, unhurried focus, and something about it communicated more than any words would have. He was here, he was a fixture, and the opinion of a visiting creditor was not of any particular interest to him. Franklin Townsend left before noon, and Hester stood watching his buggy raise a dust plume on the track leading to town, and felt such a profound relief that she had to sit down on the porch step for a moment. Owen came and sat beside her, and Walter came and put his large head in her lap, and she sat there between the man and the dog and let the relief wash through her. "He won't be back," Owen said. "No," she agreed. "He's the kind of man who moves on once the opportunity is gone." "You handled it well," Owen said. She looked at him. "I had help." He held her gaze for a moment and then looked out at the flat, pale November sky, and she saw something working in him, something coming to the surface that had been building for a while. "Hester," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for another moment, and she waited without filling the silence. "I've been thinking about what I want," he said. "Going forward, what I want my life to look like." He paused. "It took me a while to figure out how to say it because I'm not, as you may have noticed, a man with a great deal of practice at saying things." "I've noticed," she said, with the warmth she no longer bothered to conceal. The corner of his mouth moved. "What I want," he said, "involves you, considerably. That's what I've been working up to." She felt her heart doing something she had not felt in a very long time, something simple and entirely physical, a quickening. "I'm listening," she said. "I don't want to be on that ridge alone anymore," he said. "And I don't want you to be here alone anymore. I want to be here with you, building something. Both farms, combined, run well, would be worth something real. The Hale property has better water access and yours has better pasture land. Together they'd be a decent operation." He stopped and looked at her with those clear gray eyes and said, "But none of that is the actual reason I want it. The actual reason is you. Just you specifically." Hester looked at him for a long moment. She was 30 years from cynicism, and she was not going to pretend to be unmoved by what he had just said, because she was moved, deeply and genuinely, and Owen Hale deserved honesty from her the way she had always received it from him. "I want that too," she said. "I've wanted it for a while." He took a breath, and she watched the tension go out of his shoulders, the way tension goes out of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has finally set it down in safe hands. "I should do this properly," he said. "You really don't need to get theatrical about it," she said. But he slid off the porch step anyway and went down on one knee in the November dust, and Walter looked up from her lap with mild curiosity, and Owen Hale looked up at her with gray eyes full of something warm and clear and absolutely real, and said, "Hester Townsend, will you marry me?" It was not quite a question, in the way that it was the most certain he had ever sounded about anything. "Yes," she said. "Owen Hale, I absolutely will." He stood up and she stood up, and he put his hands on her face, both hands, gentle and careful, and kissed her for the first time in the cold November afternoon on her porch with the dog watching and the cattle moving at the far end of the pasture, and the ridge above them bare and bright against the gray sky. And it was the best kiss she had ever received. Warm and slow and full of everything that had been building since a pre-dawn morning, when she had raised her hand at a silhouette, and the silhouette had raised its hand in return. They told no one for a few days, simply because they were both the kind of people who preferred to sit inside something important before offering it to the world's commentary. They walked the combined properties together, talking about what they could be, what could be improved, where the cattle would range, where they would plant in spring. They were practical conversations, and they were also entirely romantic, the language of two people building a shared future. And Hester found it deeply pleasurable to stand with Owen on the ridge above her farm and look down at it together, and then look up at the Hale land beyond and see it as one thing. The Hale house needed work more than her own, but it had good bones. Stone foundation, decent roof, a wide kitchen with a deep fireplace that would be warm in winter. She walked through it with him on a gray afternoon, and he watched her face as she looked at the rooms, and she could feel his watching, the particular attention of a man who wants to know what the person he loves thinks about something that matters to him. "It's a good house," she said. "It needs a woman in it." "It needs you in it," he said. She turned and found him close, closer than she had realized, and she put her hand on the front of his shirt and looked up at him and said, "Then you'll have me in it." And he bent his head and kissed her again, this time with more sureness than the first time, like a man who had moved past the asking and into the certainty. They announced the engagement in town on a Saturday when they came in together for supplies. Rufus Colby saw them walk in together, and his eyebrows made a rapid journey toward his hairline before he recovered his professional composure. They bought what they needed, and when Hester mentioned, as matter-of-factly as she managed any announcement, that she and Owen Hale were to be married in the spring, Rufus Colby looked from her to Owen with an expression of profound reevaluation, as though he was revising a mental catalog entry in real time. "Well," Rufus said, "well, I'll be." "You'll be happy for us," Hester said pleasantly, and Rufus, to his credit, smiled and said yes, he certainly would. Word traveled through Calder Flats in the way that word always traveled through a small town, which was fast and often embellished. The sewing circle was divided between those who thought it was romantic and those who were uncertain about the ghost on the ridge becoming a respectable married man. But opinion gradually settled into something warm, largely because Owen came into town with Hester on their next trip and bought coffee at the small establishment that had opened the year before, and sat at a corner table with her, and was clearly, visibly, entirely in his right mind and deeply fond of the woman across from him. It is difficult to maintain the legend of a ghost when the ghost is sitting in the coffee shop, holding the hand of the woman he loves. The winter closed in through December and January, cold and hard, with ice on the creek and frost patterns on the window glass every morning. Hester and Owen spent the evenings at her kitchen table, planning. They went through his house room by room in their minds, deciding what could be repaired, what replaced, what could wait. They talked about the cattle management across both properties and the fencing that would need to be reorganized in spring. They talked about planting and about the possibility of getting 3 more cattle, and about whether the outbuilding on the Hale property could be converted into a workable storage barn. These evenings were among the happiest of Hester's life, and she knew it while she was in them, which was a rare and good thing. There was a fire in the stove, and the lamp on the table between them cast its warm light, and Walter slept in the corner and Owen sat close enough that their elbows touched. And sometimes the planning would drift into conversation that drifted into comfortable quiet, and in the quiet he would look at her in that particular way, steady and full and entirely there, and she would look back, and it was enough. He was carving again in the evenings, a second piece, larger than the horse, taking shape in his hands with slow, careful deliberateness. She pretended not to look too hard at it because she could tell he wanted to finish before he showed her, but she could see it was becoming a woman, a small figure of a woman standing at a window, one hand raised. She had to look away from it when she realized what it was, because her throat closed around something too big to speak. Christmas came and they spent it quietly between the two properties, and Owen gave her the finished carving on Christmas morning. She held it in both hands, this small carved woman at her window, and then she set it beside the horse on the windowsill, and they stood together looking at the pair of them in the morning light. And she took his hand without looking at him and squeezed it, and he squeezed back. January brought a storm, 3 days of driving snow and wind that left the world white and silent and strangely beautiful, and they were both snowed in at her farm for the better part of it, which was fine and good, and she fed him from her stores, and he kept her woodpile stoked, and they sat by the fire and he read aloud to her from the book of poetry she had by the fireplace, his low, slightly rough voice finding a surprising gentleness in the meter of the lines. And she sat with her mending in her lap and her eyes closed, and thought that she had not been this content since before Gerald died, and perhaps not even then, because what she had with Owen was a different quality of contentment, a deeper and more foundational kind, built on being fully known and fully chosen. After the storm broke and the world opened up again in glittering white silence, Owen went back to his property to check on things, and she stood at her kitchen window watching him walk up the ridge through the new snow. And she waved, even though he was closer than usual, and they had just said goodbye at the door. And he turned and caught it and raised his hand back, and they both held that position for a moment, the old mourning ritual performed in the new light of everything that had changed. And it felt like both a continuation and a celebration. The spring wedding was planned for April, which was practical because April in that part of Texas was typically past the worst of the mud and before the worst of the heat. They chose a Sunday, and Hester asked the Reverend Macy at the small Baptist church to perform the ceremony, and the Reverend agreed with a warm enthusiasm that Hester suspected was partly genuine pleasure and partly a relief that Owen Hale was becoming fully part of the community after so many years of semi-absence. Owen, for his part, approached the wedding planning with the same focused attention he brought to everything, neither particularly excited by the ceremonial aspects nor dismissive of them, simply interested in getting them right because they mattered to Hester, and what mattered to Hester mattered to him. He asked her questions about what she wanted and listened carefully to the answers, and then made sure those things happened. He also, entirely of his own initiative, repaired and cleaned and painted the interior of the Hale house through February and March, turning it from a bachelor's bare necessity dwelling into something warm and livable. He put up new shelving in the kitchen. He repaired the staircase. He found a rug at the general store and laid it in the sitting room. He built a new bed frame from the good dark wood of a fallen oak on the property, working on it in the evenings, and when it was done, it was a beautiful piece of furniture, solid and true, with a headboard that had been smooth-planed until it was like silk under the hand. When Hester came to see what he had done to the house in early April, a week before the wedding, she walked through the rooms slowly and quietly, and at the end she stood in the middle of the kitchen and turned in a circle, taking it in. And then she looked at Owen standing in the doorway and she said, "You made a home." He looked at the kitchen. "We'll make it a home," he said. "I just made it ready." The wedding day was clear and bright, the kind of April morning that felt like a promise. Hester wore a dress of blue-gray wool that she had made herself over the winter, simple and well-fitted, with small pearl buttons at the wrist that had belonged to her mother. Owen wore a white shirt he had bought in town and dark trousers and his good boots, and he had shaved close and combed his hair. And when she came down the aisle of the small white church toward him, and he turned to look at her, what crossed his face was so openly and completely everything it was that several women in the pews found themselves reaching for their handkerchiefs. There were more people at the wedding than either of them had expected. The town of Calder Flats, apparently, had a great deal of investment in the ghost coming back. Rufus Colby was there, and the ladies of the sewing circle, and several farming families from the surrounding land who had known Hester from her years as Gerald's wife, and had watched her manage the farm alone with respect. There were even a few of the old-timers who remembered Marcus Hale, Owen's father, and who looked at Owen with a complicated mixture of memory and gladness. Owen said his vows in a clear, steady voice that did not waver, looking at her directly, and the words that came out of his mouth were the most honest and straightforward vows Hester had ever heard, because he had written them himself rather than relying entirely on Reverend Macy's formula. And they went. "I intend to be here, Hester, which is a thing I am not always good at with the world. But I am good at it with you, and I intend to spend the rest of my life being here with you as fully as I know how." She cried a little, which she had not expected to do, and he produced a handkerchief from his jacket pocket with a quiet efficiency that suggested he had anticipated this possibility, which made her laugh through the tears, which was perhaps the ideal emotional state in which to be married. They returned to the Hale house, which was now their house, in the late afternoon. Walter had been brought over with great ceremony by the neighbor boy who had been minding him, and he greeted them both with the unrestrained enthusiasm that was his dominant characteristic, and then went and lay down by the kitchen fireplace as though he had always been there, and intended to remain. That evening they sat on the wide front porch of the Hale house, which looked west across the ridge and down toward the flats, and the sunset came in long and slow and spectacular, painting the sky in colors that seemed impossibly generous. And Owen had his arm around her shoulders, and she had her head against his shoulder, and the warmth between them was the kind of warmth that starts deep and radiates outward, the warmth of a life that has found its shape. "I want to tell you something," she said, after the sun had set and the first stars were showing. "Tell me," he said. "I waved at you every morning for weeks before I knew who you were," she said, "and it still felt significant. Even then, just that silhouette on the ridge stopping and raising its hand, it felt like something." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was the first friendly gesture I'd seen from another person in a long time. I thought about it for the rest of the day after the first time." She looked up at him. "You did?" "I'd start the morning walk, and somewhere in the back of my mind I'd be calculating the time until I reached that point on the ridge where I could see your window," he said. "I told myself I was checking the pasture line." She laughed softly. "That is very much a thing you would tell yourself." "I'm aware," he said, and she felt the movement of something like a laugh in his chest against her cheek. "Owen," she said, "yes. I'm very glad you didn't keep walking that first morning." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, warm and certain. "So am I," he said. Every day, so am I. Spring came fully into its own through April and May, and the combined properties of Townsend and Hale, now operating as a single farm under a single management, began to show the results of having two capable and committed people working it. They reorganized the cattle across both properties, and the spring grass was good, the best in several years according to the older neighbors, and the calves were strong and numerous. Hester's kitchen garden was expanded onto the Hale property's better sun-facing slope, and the new rows of vegetables stretched out in straight, promising lines in the spring earth. They worked well together. This was something Hester had sensed before and discovered to be fully true in the daily reality of sharing a life. She and Owen had a complementary quality about them. She was quick to decide, and he was thorough to execute. She was outward-facing and social, and he was observant and precise. And the places where one was weaker, the other was stronger, without either of them having to diminish themselves to make it work. There were mornings when he was difficult, she discovered. Not cold or unkind, but distant in a way that she had learned to read as the residue of something from before her, from those years of the war and the years of the ridge, working its way up through the ordinary surface of the day like water finding a crack. On those mornings, she did not push. She gave him the space of a kitchen table and 2 cups of coffee and the ordinary morning sounds of the farm, and usually by mid-morning, whatever it was had passed through him and he was present again, and he would look at her across whatever they were doing and say her name, just her name, and she would look back, and that was enough. She loved him in those difficult mornings as much as any other time, perhaps more, because it was a fuller love that included the knowledge of his hardest places. And he knew it. She could see that he knew it, in the way he settled when he came back to himself, the deep, settled way of a man who knows he is safe where he is. She found out she was expecting in July. She sat with the knowledge for a day before she told him, not because she wanted to keep it from him, but because she wanted to sit inside it alone for a little while first, to feel the private, extraordinary weight of it before it became a shared thing. She lay in their bed in the morning while he was already up and starting on the farm work, and she held her hands flat against her stomach and felt the silence of it and the enormity of it and the specific, fierce gladness that moved through her like a river finding its proper course. She told him that evening. They were at the kitchen table after supper, and she said his name in a way that made him look up from the almanac he was reading, attentive and focused. "I think we're having a baby," she said. Owen Hale, who was a man of deep and settled stillness, went perfectly still in a way that was entirely different from his usual stillness. A richer, more full-bodied stillness, the stillness of a man in whom something vast and warm had just opened. Then he pushed back his chair and came around the table, and she stood up and he held her, not saying anything, just held her with both arms with a completeness and a care that made her press her face into his shoulder and hold on. "When?" he said against her hair. "February, I think," she said. "Maybe early March." He pulled back enough to look at her face, and his gray eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was in the same family of feeling, and he said, "Are you all right? How do you feel?" "I feel wonderful," she said, and meant it on every level. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, and then both her cheeks and then her mouth, and she could feel the depth of what he was feeling and the tenderness of it. This man who had spent so many years alone on a ridge with no one to give his care to, suddenly having more to hold than he could contain. She told Rufus Colby in September, when she came in for supplies and her figure had begun to speak for itself, and Rufus immediately told everyone he saw for the rest of the week, which saved her the trouble. The sewing circle descended with gifts and advice and a great deal of warm feeling, and Hester received it with genuine gratitude, because she understood that these women were expressing a communal gladness that went beyond social convention, a gladness that the ghost had come home and found something worth staying for. October on the combined farm was busy and good. The cattle were strong going into the fall, and their numbers were up from the spring. The harvest from the kitchen garden was the best she had grown in years, the new soil's generosity proving itself. Owen built shelves in the spare bedroom for the baby's things, working on them in the evenings with a focused care that she found enormously moving. She still waved at him from the kitchen window every morning when he went out early to check the cattle, and he still stopped and raised his hand in return, and the ritual had changed completely and not at all. It was still the morning greeting between two people who chose each other, still that small daily affirmation, but now it contained everything that had happened since the first time. All the mornings of bread on the fence post and carved horses and coffee at the kitchen table and hands held across the width of dark wood, all of it folded inside the simple raising of a hand. Winter came early in 1875, with snow in November and a cold that stayed. Hester's pregnancy made the cold uncomfortable in ways it had not been before, and Owen built up the kitchen fire to a size and constancy that had been beyond her lone management, and she moved through the warmth of their house with the specific, internal wealth of a woman who has exactly what she needs. He read to her in the evenings. He had found a box of his mother's books in the back bedroom of the house, books that had survived 20 years of dust and disuse in surprisingly good condition, and he would sit by the fire with one of them and read aloud in that low, rough voice that had found its ease and its music over the months of their marriage. And she would sit across from him with her mending or her knitting, and the child inside her would occasionally move under her hands, and she would look up at Owen, and he would look up from the page, and they would share the knowledge of it without speaking. The baby came on a cold, clear February morning in 1876, arriving with the purposeful urgency that would prove characteristic of his nature. A boy, healthy and strong and loud, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determined mouth, and he arrived with the dawn light just coming into the bedroom windows and Owen sitting on the side of the bed holding Hester's hand through all of it, present and entirely without the particular male helplessness that afflicted some men in these circumstances, simply present and steady and there. When the midwife, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Potter from the edge of town, put the baby into Hester's arms, and Hester looked down at this small, fierce, extremely disgruntled-looking person, she laughed, a real laugh, clear and deep, And then she looked up at Owen and found him looking at their son with an expression of such open, unguarded wonder that she felt her heart turn over in her chest. "He looks angry," Owen said. "He's been evicted," Hester said. "Give him a moment." The baby quieted when Owen put out his hand, one finger, and the baby wrapped his fist around it with the grip of someone who intended to hold on. And Owen looked down at those small fingers around his, and his face did something she had never seen it do, something entirely new, a fullness that went beyond even the most unguarded moments she had seen before, as though some room in him that had been locked for a very long time had opened all the way. "What are we calling him?" Owen said quietly. She had thought about this. "Marcus," she said, "after your father." Owen looked up at her, and there were tears in his gray eyes now, actual tears, the first she had ever seen from him, and he did not try to prevent them or excuse them, simply let them be there as they were, which was one more way in which he had changed in the year since their wedding, and she loved him for it completely. "Marcus," he said, trying the name. The baby, as if in response, tightened his grip on Owen's finger. "He seems to agree," Hester said. Marcus Owen Hale was entered into the town register at Calder Flats in February 1876, and if the Reverend seemed particularly pleased to be writing the name, and if the town in general seemed to take a collective warmth from the fact of the ghost on the ridge having a son, well, Hester was not in any position to resent the sentiment. The ghost on the ridge had become, in the course of 14 months, a husband and a father and a full member of the community, and the town of Calder Flats had made its peace with having been wrong about him, which was the best a town could do. Owen came into town more regularly now, not frequently, that was not in his nature, but with a presence that acknowledged the community's existence rather than actively avoiding it. He stopped at the general store when he needed things, and he spoke to the other men about cattle and land and the weather. And he was not what anyone would call gregarious, but he was there, and he was real, and the legend of the ghost had quietly, permanently retired. Summer brought the baby into a new round of activity and personality, and Marcus Hale proved himself to be a person of strong and specific opinions from a remarkably early age, which Owen found interesting and Hester found mostly amusing. He was a healthy, active, curious child who showed an early fascination with everything outdoors, particularly the cattle, and Owen would carry him on his shoulders during the morning check of the pastures, and Marcus would sit up there like a small king, surveying his domain with great satisfaction. Hester stood at her kitchen window one morning in that summer, coffee in hand in the early light, watching her husband and son move along the fence line in the yellow grass, and she raised her hand out of old habit, just the gesture of it, and Owen, 100 yards away, turned his head and saw it, and raised his own hand back, and Marcus on his shoulders, seeing his father's gesture, raised his own small arm in enthusiastic imitation. And Hester laughed alone in her kitchen, so that her coffee sloshed in its cup, and Walter, elderly now but still large and warm and present on the hearthrug, lifted his head to see what was funny. The carved horse and the carved woman at the window still sat side by side on the kitchen windowsill of the Hale house, and Owen had added a third figure over the winter, a small man with his hat on, and now he had added a fourth, tiny, barely formed yet but unmistakably, a child held up in someone's arms. He worked on it in the evenings by the fire while she read or knitted, his hands moving with that quiet attention, and she would look up sometimes and watch him work and feel the same thing she had felt the first time she watched him split her firewood. Something deeply peaceful and deeply right about the sight of him absorbed in a task in her space, in their space, in the home they were building. She asked him once, a winter evening in their second year of marriage, if he missed the solitude. It was a direct question, and she would not have asked it of a man who could not handle direct questions, but Owen Hale had never been a man who could not handle directness. He simply had not always had anyone to be direct with. He thought about it with genuine consideration. "I miss the simplicity of it sometimes," he said honestly. "Not the loneliness, but the simplicity, Everything at once is complicated." "It is," she agreed. He looked at her across the fire. "The complication is worth it," he said. "I want you to know that, every part of it." She held his gaze. "Even the days when you can't talk," he nodded slowly. "Even those, you don't make those days harder, you make them possible." She got up and went and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and she settled against his side. And the fire moved and the baby slept in his bed in the next room and Walter breathed slow and steady on the rug. And outside the Texas winter was dark and cold, and entirely outside their concern. The second summer, 1877, brought a drought that tested every farm in Calder Flats and the surrounding land. The creek dropped to a thin, worried trickle, and the grass went brown, and Hester and Owen spent long, grinding days moving cattle to better water, and supplementing their feed, and watching the sky for clouds that came and went without delivering anything useful. It was hard work and it was worrying, but they went through it together, and there is a particular quality of bond that forms between two people who have managed a genuine difficulty together without breaking, without blaming, without allowing the strain of the external to crack the internal. They lost 2 cattle in the drought, which was a loss but not a disaster. Their combined resources and management, the strategic decisions they had made about water access and pasture rotation, meant they were better positioned than some of their neighbors. And when the rains finally came in October, they came with a lavish, apologetic generosity that restored the creek and greened the grass within a week. Owen stood in the rain on the back porch one October afternoon, not moving to come in out of it, simply standing with his face turned up and the water soaking into his hat and running off his coat, and Hester came and stood beside him, and they stood in the rain together without speaking, and the relief of it was enormous, physical, like a long-held muscle finally releasing. She found out about the second baby in November of 1877, and this time she told him the same evening, sitting across the kitchen table in the lamplight with her hands around her coffee cup, because she had learned that there was no better pleasure than watching Owen Hale's face in the moment when she told him something that filled him up like that. He looked at her with that full, bright stillness, and then he said, "Marcus is going to be terrible about sharing your attention." She laughed. "Marcus is going to be the most devoted older brother in the territory." "Also possible," Owen allowed. The second baby came in the late spring of 1878, a girl this time, arriving with more patience than her brother had demonstrated, as though she had decided to take her time and do it right. They named her Ellen after Owen's mother, and she had Hester's coloring and Owen's quiet gray eyes, and from her first days she looked at the world with an observant, thoughtful attention that made Owen say, softly, watching her from the side of the crib, "She's going to be a watcher." "Like her father," Hester said. He looked at her. "I hope she has more company than her father did," he said. "She already does," Hester said. "She has all of us." Marcus, who was 2.5 and had strong opinions about the new arrival, settled into the role of older brother with an intensity that was frequently inconvenient and deeply touching. He wanted to be near the baby constantly, and referred to her as his with a proprietary confidence that made Owen laugh, quiet and private, in the way he had learned to laugh, the way that had come back to him over the years of this marriage. By the summer of 1878, the Hale farm was one of the better functioning operations in the area around Calder Flats, not the largest, not the wealthiest, but well-run and healthy and growing. Owen had expanded the cattle to 30 head, and they had put in a proper hay storage structure the previous fall that meant they went into winter with adequate feed for the first time in Hester's memory on either property. She had expanded her garden's commercial side, selling produce and preserves in town, which brought in a steady small income that made the household accounts look considerably better than they had in those first years of her widowhood. She was, she understood, exactly where she was supposed to be. Not in the way of fatalism, not in the sense of having had no choice, but in the best possible sense. She had made choices, clear-eyed and deliberate choices, And those choices had led her here, to this kitchen, to this window, to this man and these children and this life that was full and warm and entirely real. She thought sometimes about that first morning, the mist on the pasture and the shape on the ridge, and the impulse to wave that had been so natural and unthought that it was barely even a decision. She thought about the long chain of it, from that first wave to the bread on the fence post, to the herbs in a jar on the windowsill, to the coffee across the kitchen table, to his hand over hers, and his voice saying her name in the way that nobody else had ever said it, like it was important, like it was something worth saying carefully. And she thought, what if she hadn't waved? What if she had turned back to her stove without raising her hand? What if the impulse toward connection had been overridden by the habit of privacy, the reasonable self-containment of a woman alone on a farm at dawn? Then she stopped thinking about it, because there was no use in what-ifs, and because the children needed feeding and the cattle needed checking, and Owen was already out at the pasture fence with Marcus on his shoulders, and any moment now he was going to turn and look toward the house, and she had a cup of coffee to drink and a hand to raise. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee in the September morning of 1878, and Owen was at the fence 100 yards out, and Marcus was on his shoulders pointing at something with great authority, and little Ellen was on Hester's hip, just awake and still soft with sleep, looking at the world over her mother's arm with those thoughtful gray eyes. Hester raised her hand. Owen turned as he always turned and raised his hand back. Marcus saw the exchange and raised both of his arms above his head in a gesture of pure, extravagant greeting, and Owen laughed. A real laugh, all the way. The kind of laugh that carried across 100 yards of morning air to the window where Hester stood. She had wanted to hear that laugh for a long time. She heard it regularly now. Ellen, watching her father and brother in the pasture, raised her own small hand in imitation of her mother's wave, the tiny fingers spread wide and uncertain, and Hester looked at her daughter's profile, the serious eyes and the soft cheek and the small hand held up in the morning light, and felt the particular, specific happiness of a woman who has built something true. Walter, who was old now, 9 or 10 years and gray around the muzzle, came and pressed against her leg, warm and familiar, and she reached down and put her hand on his broad head, and they stood together at the window, the woman and the dog and the baby, in the morning light of a September day in 1878, watching the man in the pasture and the boy on his shoulders, and the wave between them hung in the air like something permanent, like a thing that had always been there and always would be. The town of Calder Flats still told the story of the ghost on the ridge, but the story had changed its character. It was no longer a story about absence and strangeness, about a figure that existed at the periphery of the real world and looked in but never entered. It was a love story now, the story of the woman at the kitchen window who had waved at something she barely saw, and the man who had stopped to receive it and had never, not once in all the years that followed, stopped being grateful that she had. It was the kind of story that towns needed, that people needed, the evidence that showing up, the simple, quiet, daily showing up, was enough to change everything. That kindness offered without calculation, bread on a fence post, a hand raised in the early morning, could reach across 300 yards of misty pasture and find a man on a ridge and bring him home. Owen Hale had been called a ghost by the town because nobody ever saw him. Hester Townsend had seen him every morning from her kitchen window and waved. And that, as it turned out, had been enough. He came in from the pasture at mid-morning, Marcus running ahead of him across the yard, and Hester had coffee ready and the kitchen warm. And he came through the door and she turned from the stove and he crossed the kitchen to her and kissed her, unhurried. There in the morning kitchen with Ellen in the chair and Marcus tugging at his father's hand with news of great importance about a beetle he had found by the fence. And it was ordinary and it was everything, the full, simple, immeasurable weight of an ordinary life made extraordinary by the person you spent it with. "Good morning," she said against his mouth. "Good morning," he said, and pulled back to look at her, those clear gray eyes at close range, warm and certain and entirely present, the same as they had always been from the moment she first looked into them over a tangle of wire and a sagging fence. The kitchen window caught the September light and threw it across the table where the almanac sat and the coffee cups waited and the children's noise rose and fell like a tide. And on the sill in a row stood 4 small carved figures: a horse, a woman at a window, a man with his hat on, and a child held up in someone's arms. Owen had been working on a 5th figure in the evenings, small and new, for Ellen. And it was not finished yet, but it was coming, patient and careful and true, shaped by hands that had learned what they were for and were now entirely occupied in the work of it. Outside, the September morning continued its unhurried business across the Texas plains, and the ridge above the farm stood in the clear light the way it always stood, solid and permanent. And on its top the trace of a walking path was still visible in the grass, the path of a man who had crossed it every morning for years alone, until the morning he stopped and raised his hand at a kitchen window, and something shifted in the world quietly, without announcement, the way the most important things always do.